The topic of today's presentation from Dr. Bill Lester is on business incentives, and of course the economy and the relationship between Americans and their government is a topic that's much in the debate today, with Governor Romney's 47% comment and President Obama's comment about "you didn't build that." So there's a lot of debate today about the nature of the relationship between citizens and their government when it comes to the economy, and incentives are a classic example of that debate and how it can be very vexing and difficult to deal with. And so we're delighted to have Dr. Lester here with us today. To introduce him, I'm going to ask Alan Fryer from the Justice Center and the Budget and Tax Center to come forward. Alan is a student, a colleague of Dr. Lester's, and a collaborator, and is going to tell us a little bit more about it. So come forward.
Thanks, Rob. I realized I maybe should have checked with Rob before putting together my remarks, because he said what I had planned on saying. So unless you've been asleep, you know that we are robustly debating how to create jobs in the economy, and one of the most common tools that are used is incentives. It's not just controversial; it's extremely common. But given the fact that they're common, we want to make sure that they actually do what they purport to do. And all too often, I think we start with the posture of critiquing these policies, and for many reasons that Bill will get into. But what's special about today is that this piece of research looks at, moves beyond the question of whether they work to how they can work better, how we can make sure that they actually yield the returns that we expect and what we need given the difficult economic circumstances. So I'm pleased to introduce Bill. He's a third-year assistant professor of city and regional planning at UNC Chapel Hill. His research largely focuses on the role of social institutions and policy interventions in reducing income inequality and poverty. He's done work for the Center on American Progress on the minimum wage and living wage laws, and recently published a study on the impact of living wage laws on patterns of economic development in urban areas, in California cities in particular. He recently completed a comprehensive evaluation of the effectiveness of Chicago's tax increment financing policy. TIF is new to North Carolina, and so this is something that we're looking forward to hearing about more in the future here in North Carolina. Bill's also done a lot of work around the green economy. So his research expertise is widespread within economic development, and we're very lucky to have him here to present on this paper, which a couple other folks at UNC, including myself and Dr. Nicola Lowe, collaborated on. So Dr. Bill Lester.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thanks, Alan, for that really nice introduction. I hear from everybody that you're doing excellent work here. And, we want you to stay with the department and finish your dissertation as well as even though you're doing excellent work at the Justice Center. Thank you all for coming today, and thanks to the Budget and Tax Center for inviting me to come and speak and share with you some of the results of the research that I've been doing over the past year or so with Alan and Nicola Lowe. So the title of my talk is Business Incentives, Where They Work and Where They Don't. Originally it was also titled Mediating Incentives, so we're going to be using this word mediated or mediation quite a bit today. But just want to start by giving a little bit of an outline of where I want to go today. I want to talk a little bit about the theoretical context for looking at or investigating incentives. Talk about the background, particularly in North Carolina, how incentives sort of fit into the economic development policy framework in the state. I'm going to present some stylized facts about how incentives have been used, at least over the past 10 to 15 years. And this is drawn from a sort of a database that was produced at UNC. I'll present the research questions and the findings, and then hopefully spend a bit more time with you collaboratively talking about the conclusions and policy implications. And this is a little bit a different type of talk that I'm used to giving, because I've cut out all of the regression equations and all of the method slides, hopefully for your benefit. But I did save them at the end. So if anybody wants to see Greek letters or equations and talk more about that, I'm happy to do that. I'll also say that I think on each of the tables there's a copy of the paper. If there isn't, I'd be happy to give you a copy of the working paper or send that to you via email. Other thing is, I consider this sort of an informal discussion, so if there's something along the way that either you have a question about or you want to have a comment, please just stop me and we'll have a kind of a conversation as we go. But then I'll also reserve some time to have a discussion at the end. So in terms of the motivation, why should we care about incentives? And I think Alan and Rob sort of set the stage better than I can, but they are essentially a very common tool, but remain highly controversial, both in practice, in politics, as well as within the academy. So most people focus on planners. A paper from the leading planning journal says that they're inefficient use of public dollars. Just from an efficiency point of view, states and local governments, the estimate that they come up with, spend about $50 billion a year on business incentives of some form or another. That's a big number, especially when states are trying to cut, every last program or save every last dollar. Some folks in the advocacy community and also other researchers have said that it's essentially, if you think about it, a zero-sum game between the states. So from a US point of view, a national economic growth point of view, they really don't make a lot of sense because essentially they're moving jobs from state to state, so that's really not efficient either, and actually kind of creates some sort of inequitable results across states. And there's also work that suggests that it may not actually benefit local workers. So the incentive granting agency or state may provide a grant to an outside company, but the workers that end up getting hired are brought in, say, from their original home location, or workers are induced to migrate to the region where the new firm is coming. So from a cost-benefit point of view of that granting agency, that don't make a lot of sense. Another sort of classic piece in economic development literature looks at economic development, sort of the practice of what economic developers do, and say that there's a systems bias. This is a famous paper by Rubin with my favorite title of all academic papers, Shoot Anything That Flies and Claim Anything That Falls. And it's describing the practice of what economic developers do when they're meeting with outside firms. And it's essentially that they're at a disadvantage and that there's a systems bias created sort of to favor the economic interest of mobile capital, mobile business. So that's some of the background. In practice, also, there's this sense that incentives are antithetical to this idea of long-range strategic planning, or planning that involves investing in human capital, various sectoral strategies focused on essentially common pool resources. So that it's antithetical to the idea of let's support a whole, either an industry or a sector, or just increase the human capital of our populace generally, and that will provide economic development benefits, as opposed to trying to pick winners, pick individual companies that may or may not work. It's sort of seen as antithetical, in the literature and in the past. But what this work highlights, building off of a paper by my colleague Nicolas Lowe, who looked at this process of mediation in the biotech industry, that these two practices can actually be somewhat complementary. It's something we're going to come back to, but I think the debate around incentives has kind of historically been a yes-no, anti-pro kind of debate. And as much as we think as academic researchers, are researchers going to get out there and change practice immediately, we kind of are realizing that if we had a paper that said incentives are bad, incentive use is not going to sort of stop overnight, right? So this research builds on her early research to say that perhaps there are some complementarities between this long-range strategic planning activities and incentives. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. So in terms of the context, I was telling Rob earlier that I am a newcomer to North Carolina, so I don't know the long view of planning in North Carolina as well as maybe some of you do, but I'll kind of give you the highlights, at least as the way I understand them. North Carolina sort of is, what I've heard, is unique among at least the southern states or southeast states in that they've had a long-term commitment to higher education and funding higher education on a level that is sort of different than surrounding areas, which has led to sort of very strong economic development impacts for the state. There's the whole history around the founding of Research Triangle Park, which we can debate on who started it, who took the lead, whether it was actually private versus public, but the story, at least for my purposes, is that it was a collaborative process between 3 universities in the Triangle, some private actors who were interested in promoting the region as a whole, rather than going after one particular company or saying, if we get doing a headhunting process, if we get this one company, then we'll have a Research Triangle Park. But it was sort of a longer-term strategic initiative. But building upon that success, the state has a history of going after or sort of supporting whole sectors rather than individual firms. This is through the founding of the Biotech Center. So this is the first state that had a center for sort of pursuing and supporting and building that industry cluster. Started way back in 1981. There's also other examples of this with the State Textiles College, the Nonwoven Institute, about 10 years later. The Microelectronics Center is no longer in its current form, but is another example of this sort of state-led or state-funded sectoral initiative. There's also been a history of regional planning and trying to get regions to do economic development planning in a consistent way. So there's the 7 regional partnerships that were created or drawn in 2000. And then there was a planning process around trying to define what were the emerging industry clusters in these regions. And I think some faculty at UNC were involved in that, and certainly the Commerce Department as well. But the bottom line is that, at least from my understanding and my view of North Carolina, is that traditionally the emphasis has been on supporting common pool resources that can be shared by firms throughout an entire sector, rather than a focus on the headhunting per se. In terms of from that history, I want to define a couple of key terms that I'm going to come back to in the actual research itself, in terms of how we characterize what we call strategic economic development. So we're going to talk about regional targets. These are the industries that came out of that cluster planning process at the regional level. So we looked at, so industrial targets are set by these regional partnerships. We separate these, whatever the target industries are, from we went and read these plans, these 7 regional plans, and we said, okay, industries that are being targeted by the plans are either those that are sort of building on established legacies. There already is an existing sort of manufacturing center in Western North Carolina, and they're trying to build on that target, or what we call aspirational targets. These are industries that are saying the regions want to go after, but they don't already have a big concentration as measured by like a location quotient. So they don't already have that industry, but they're kind of going after it. The caveat that, in terms of the research design, is that we can't directly observe that planners are going, when they use incentives, are saying, we're using it because it's our target. We don't see that link, but we're going to make that sort of association. And more importantly, what we're talking about is mediated sectors. And these are the sectors that have this strong state-level institutional representation. So this is where there's the really deep, much deeper strategic planning going on. And these are sectors, basically, we define them formally as sectoral institutions which mediate or govern state and local recruitment and retention activities. So there's sort of a third agent in the room there. And these are the particular sectors that we're focusing on are life sciences and the textiles nonwoven. So those are the 2 active state-supported centers that are there. So we're looking at incentives in these particular industries and seeing if there's sort of a difference there. And this is not just based on our projection, but supported by the existing work that I already mentioned there. Nicola's earlier work on the Biotech Center. So we built a lot of our argument on mediation. Why is this important? It's not just like an inventory of these institutions. Okay, we have these 2, and therefore we're calling that mediation. But mediation really involves something more active. It involves institutional engagement in local and economic development. So these are establishing and maintaining relationships with firms that once they're here, they're maintaining a relationship with these centers. It's identifying and responding to ongoing and emergent sector challenges. So there's a nice story that Nicola tells in her paper of basically we're sort of the work of these mediating institutions can help revise incentives to sort of address shifting needs. And in the case of the biomedical sector, the folks at the Biotech Center were able to sort of vet the science of proposed companies and help translate that to funding institutions like banks. So in an era where venture capital is kind of drying up, they were able to sort of make that connection and build, and essentially get people more finance or fill these financial gaps in a way that made the incentive itself less important. But it was really that connection that was what was really important. So they set strong economic development standards at multiple scales that can sort of help say essentially what is a good bet for a company, what's a good match to local economic developers. And they stitch together and align sort of the recruitment, retention, and entrepreneurial activities in a certain industry, right? So they're not just doing a business attraction, they're sort of concerned about the whole picture. So just as another example, or kind of just drilling down a little deeper of how this mediation is achieved, you can look at, in the case of the life sciences, as really there being sort of three active agents in the institution, right? So broadly determined. There's the biotech center itself, which focuses on strategic industry analysis, building relationships with firms that might be considering moving to North Carolina, but they also have people on staff with deep knowledge of the industry. There's the people from commerce who are the traditional folks who are doing business attraction and retention deals, and certainly in charge of using the tools. And then there's the bio network of North Carolina community colleges. So a big part of the recruitment pitch would be essentially connecting firms with specialized training. And so bringing in the community colleges here is particularly important. So a biotech firm, biopharma firms who are coming to essentially consider moving to North Carolina or being approached is really interacting with multiple actors. Whereas in a non-mediated industry, this kind of process is either doesn't exist or is less important or less prevalent. That's what we're saying. So why does it matter in terms of economic development outcomes around incentives? We argue that it allows for a better screening and matchmaking between the potential firms that would come to North Carolina. It helps eliminate bad fits between a community and a company. And they really, through this process, emphasize the quality of the labor force and the strength of the workforce development supports that exist here. So it's a way of passing on information to mobile firms that highlights the non-incentive portions of why it's an attractive place to do business. So the strength of the workforce. Also connections that would be made to existing resources within the region or within the state, such as the R&D networks that are already here. And through her work, it helped highlight that there's a shift of the bargaining position between the sort of location consultant who's coming around and shopping between North Carolina and South Carolina and other places, and the community. So it gives a little bit more power, or feeling of more power in the bargain to local practitioners. That's sort of the argument. And ultimately, what this means is that the value of the incentive itself is less now that you see the value of all the other institutional supports, right? So it makes incentives kind of not the most important thing, but it's part of a larger sort of economic development pitch. Support network, I think would be a better word. So in terms of North Carolina's history with incentives itself, I've always had, from looking around the other parts of the country that I've been from or have a chance to study, that North Carolina sort of came late to the game of incentives in an official state way, state-supported way. There was the William S. Lee Act in 1996 was the first sort of officially sanctioned way of getting into the game of incentives. Later on, there was the One North Carolina Fund, which provided state funds. I believe that has to have a local match. That's correct. That provides money for incentives. And then there's the Job Development Investment Grants. Those are sort of the three main programs that we're sort of following when we build the database that we're going to look at. But that's the sort of the policy background. There are a fair amount, quite a large amount, or really we don't really know the exact share of incentives that are only made by the local government. So counties or cities that are offering incentives, if they're not partnering with one of these programs, we don't observe this. So this is definitely going on. This is an area that we want to do research on. When we have in our database a firm that's gotten an incentive from either One North Carolina or JDIG, we do observe essentially if there is a local match, we register that. But the incentive granting process that's going on that's local only, we don't really have a good sense of how much that is and the effectiveness of that by itself. I imagine that the values are lower because they're smaller budgets. But compared to that sort of previous sort of long-term history, we characterize incentives as sort of the emerging practice in North Carolina rather than the traditional norm. And so the overarching research question we have, not just about this paper, but in the sort of series of papers that we're all kind of considering, is how do these two forms of economic development practice evolve together? How have they evolved, and how can they evolve more effectively? Question?
I'm sorry, I'm a newcomer to all of this.
Okay.
But why is the mediation not an incentive? Why is offering those services to a business not as much good as an incentive as cash?
Well, it's, I would say it is an incentive. All that support that you get in connections to community college, it works like an incentive, but it's different than an incentive because it's there for any particular firm that might come along. It's not a firm-specific, a recruitment. It's not saying I'm going to give money to Novartis. If they pick up and leave, they're gone. Whereas if we fund something like the Biotech Center, that's going to be there. They're going to be doing the work no matter what, right? So it's sort of more of a common pool resource rather than a individual. But I think your point is well taken that this is part of our economic development attraction strategy, one part of it. But it's at least in this paper, we're characterizing it as sort of more of the strategic, on the strategic side than on the shoot anything that flies, claim anything that falls.
Another question about that.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the One North Carolina Fund requires a local match. What about the Lee Act and the JDIGs? Do they require local matches as well?
I believe the Lee Act is a statutory. So if you create jobs, you're going to get this funding. Right? And then
State funding?
I can answer that.
Yeah.
The William S. Lee Act created a series of tax credits, many of which have been repealed going forward, but are still given to firms. The JDIG gives, JDIG is a discretionary grant, and it is not atypical to have a local match, to have a local incentive as well, but it's not required under statute.
Whereas One North Carolina requires it.
Yeah.
And I think the match requirement varies based on the tier that you're, is that correct? If you're
the
tier
match
one,
requirement?
the percentage that you have to match? We'll get back to that.
Yeah.
We're going to look at some figures in a minute, so we should see that. So in terms of how incentives have been used, the timing that we have here is from 1996 to 2008, where we have this data set, which, and I'll talk more detail about later, but it's essentially compiled by the Keenan Institute from media reports about incentives. So this is through media searches. And we can look at sort of the number of incentives that were granted over time has certainly increased in the 2000s, right? A high increase between, say, 2001 and 2006. There were some that sort of fell off in the last couple of years. And in terms of the amounts, they've also gone up sort of in a secular way, but it does vary from year to year. So there could be some large amount, some large deal that sort of skews it from a year-to-year basis. In terms of how we've been using incentives versus retention versus recruitment, we actually, all the results review are breaking down separately retention deals from recruitment deals. So just how many of them are going on. Total, there's been about 387 of these deals that involve these state programs. 44% have been for retention or expansion of an existing firm, and 55% for recruitment. In terms of the total incentive amounts offered, obviously more has been spent on this side, actually, $1.7 million versus the $608 million. In terms of the job expected, also, therefore, you can see that there's a lot more jobs involved. These are announced jobs from the media report, how many jobs will be saved or created. And then the incentive amount per job is lower, and so that kind of fits with the economist's point of view that you pay somebody a little bit less because they already have some sunk cost here. So the average amount that we're giving to a firm is a little bit lower. Across our sort of industries of interest. Oh yeah.
Do you have any data on the average salary for those jobs?
No, because this is only from the media report. It wouldn't tell you on an accurate way the wage level. I mean, there's often, sometimes they'll say, does the pay better than the county average? But that particular variable wasn't sort of populated enough in the database for us to say anything meaningful.
There are statutory requirements, at least for JDIG, that it has to be a certain threshold in order, so the wage has to be high enough in order to receive the incentive. I don't know what that threshold is. You might, Krista. But.
Not off the top of my head.
Okay.
Okay.
You're right.
So because that didn't feel strongly enough about that data, I didn't want to present the difference in wage between, say, retention versus recruitment. In terms of our sort of the dichotomy that we're most interested in here is the number of deals that have been in these mediated sectors versus non-mediated. Makes sense. I mean, the mediated sector is a relatively narrow part of the economy. It's biotech and textiles and non-wovens and things like that. So it's as much, only 68 deals compared to 314. But the incentive amount is lower. I mean, I wouldn't make a strong causal argument about this, but it's suggestive of what we were arguing, that the process of mediation itself allows there to be a little bit less of a direct cash incentive involved when you're sort of highlighting the rest of the role of mediation. A little bit smaller jobs per deal, and the share of that the local government kicks in is a bit higher there. In terms of the regional targets, yes or no, those that essentially did get incentives that were made in an industry in which the region that it came to was a target industry, you know, a little less than half of the deals were done in those particular targets. And when there was a target, this is interesting, that there was a bit more of an incentive to offer a local match or a local share. In terms of the geography of targeting, I think this is really interesting. It's not something we went into a whole lot of detail in the empirical work, is which of the regions in North Carolina tend to do a better job of matching their incentive use to purported strategic targets. The highest is in the West, 75%. There were only 40 deals. The triad seems to be doing less in terms of matching what their regional goals are. The research triangle is sort of next in line at 58%, and Charlotte about 58%. You know, on average, it's close to just under 50% of the deals. So in terms of, that's sort of the background, big picture of how we've been using incentives in the state. The point that our paper sort of took from this, or the point of departure, was, okay, so how do we know if incentivized establishments, essentially if incentives work? So we asked the question, do incentivized establishments grow faster or slower than a similar set of establishments in North Carolina? We wanted to get towards an answer to this sort of classic but-for question. So the but-for question would be, but for the incentive, would that firm have stayed or relocated here? That's what we all, I mean, in an ideal sense, everybody who's analyzing incentives wants to know that. So to get to that, I mean, we obviously don't know all the people who considered moving to North Carolina and seeing which ones decided to take an incentive or not. We can't observe things that didn't actually happen. So to answer this but-for question, we spent a lot of time trying to refine what these similar establishments are, of creating realistic control groups to compare, okay, here's the growth rate in the firm that got the incentive, here's the growth rate in a similar set of firms that were either, in the case of retentions, already located here, or in the case of recruitment, started at the same time. So that's sort of the direct empirical question we're trying to get to. But we're going to break out these deals by mediated and non-mediating to sort of answer the question is, does mediation make a difference? Are the employment performance measures better in deals that were in mediated sectors versus non-mediated sectors? And that's sort of the key question for us as well. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but in terms of the data sources, how we observe which companies got an incentive comes from this media study of 387 unique incentives involving state funds. So again, we're not observing those that just got local funds. This database had something, information including the company name, the county that it was located in, incentive amount, the industry, the NAICS code, the announced jobs, and whether or not it was a retention or a recruitment. It was compiled by the folks at the Keenan Institute, so thanks to them. We confirmed it. It confirmed the employment levels and the incentive levels with looking at the annual reports from the Department of Commerce. But we took this database of companies and matched it to a unique research database that is available now at UNC called the National Establishment Time Series. And this has data on essentially every establishment in North Carolina from 1990 to 2009 on employment. So we know where they're located and the employment level of establishments. So we took the company names and found them in this database of over 1 million companies, matched them, and then this database also contains similar information about industry and location and things like that. So with that, we constructed a panel data set of employment by year, and we also have these detailed establishment characteristics and a move history. So we know if an establishment, when it moved to North Carolina, when it moved out. It's really a rich data source. So with that, and I promised no Greek figures, so I'm just going to do a sort of a synopsis of the methodology or the research design. This is one of the first studies, I think there's another one, that is able to look at the sort of establishment level effects of incentives, because we were able to identify which ones and observe their employment over time. So we compared incentivized firms to non-incentivized firms in 2 different ways. We broke apart the retention deals and we did a before and after. Essentially, retention deals, we know the employment level before they got the incentive. So we can do it's sort of a before and after analysis or a difference in difference analysis for those. But because the recruitment ones, they just got here or they're a new establishment, we don't know what their employment was 2 years before they got an incentive. So for those, we matched them to firms in similar industries that started at the same year and had similar other characteristics. So we created a sort of a matched pair, not quite pair, but matched control group for the recruitment deals and said, okay, what's the employment over the lifetime that you're here, that you exist, and created just sort of a net change in jobs. And for each of these research designs, we break out mediated versus non-mediated. We also break out target versus non-target and look at the results separately. Any questions about this? I know it's kind of just high-level synopsis, but any questions about how we did this or how we studied them? Okay, cool. In terms of moving right into the results, these are for retention. Again, this is before and after, so we compare the growth rate of firms that got incentives to the growth rate of firms that are establishments that never had any incentives, never got anything from the state. The overall effect, again, this is the percent change. The overall effect is about 15%. So what that says is that establishments that got a retention grant had 15% faster or higher growth rate in employment compared to those that didn't get any incentive at all. So essentially, it looks like the way incentives were used in North Carolina was positive. It's positive and significant, about 15%. When we break that into our various categories, targeted industries, it wasn't a big difference, but it was slight difference. Targeted industries tended to do a little bit better than if there was an incentive in a non-target industry. We just sort of did the shoot anything that flies approach. But it's interesting, the aspirational targets, these are the ones that the regions don't already have anything in there. They're going after these rapid growth industries. The employment growth was higher in these. So if you were able to get an aspirational target in your region, it did much better than a control group of similar industries. And then the sort of biggest story here is that in the mediated industries, the growth rate was about 30% compared to non-incentivized companies in the mediated sectors. So this is comparing like to like. It's biotech and textiles to other non-incentivized biotech and textiles. And the non-mediated sectors was much lower. So it's suggested that a big reason why the incentives are positive is because we're following our strategic initiatives. So I just want to sort of pursue that argument a little bit more. One might make the case that this isn't exactly causal, that we're giving a retention grant to a firm that's already on an we're already ramping up employment, so we're just paying someone who's going to ramp up employment anyway. If you essentially run the analysis with individual lags of the individual years, you can look at what was the effect of the incentive on employment 2 years before, 1 year before, 1 year after, 2 years after. And if there was something causal, you'd like to see a jump right around the time that they got an incentive, not before. We don't have enough data to do a really fine-grained analysis, but this is the mediated sectors. Here's what's going on, and here's the non-mediated sectors. So in the non-mediated sectors, it doesn't really break trend, but in the mediated sectors, there does. So that gives you a little bit more confidence in saying that there's something going on here with the effect of the incentive itself. So that's on retention deals or retention and expansion deals. The second methodology, the second part that I talked about of matching these recruitment firms to a similar set of firms that started around the same time in the same industry, sort of this matched pairs, we're able to look at sort of the net job change of those, and it's a very similar story. Overall, it's positive. It's a little bit less positive. Again, this is a different variable. This is the net number of jobs, and before we were looking at percent change, just because of the way the research design works. But so on average, the firms that got a recruitment incentive added about 11.5 more jobs than the other group. It's not like they only created 11 jobs. They added 11.5 more than their control group. Target industries tended to do better than non-targets. And the same magnitude here, if there's mediated industries doing much better than the non-mediated industries. So that's kind of the finding. Any kind of questions about any of this before I get to the conclusions or implications? Yeah, Rob.
Is there any chance that don't know, I'm thinking that it might be indicative of the fact that a company has its act together, that they're able to access incentives in the mediation process. You know, could it be a reflection just on the fact that, you know what I'm saying? It's not just the mediation itself, but it's that somebody that would figure out a way to get connected to mediation might themselves be a more with it. Their act together.
Right, that there's sort of a selection bias issue going on, that they're saying those who get the incentive are already well run, organized, and have consultants. That's possible. That could be going on here. Again, we're mixing many deals overall. I mean, within, you know, overall we have 387. So did all 387 have their act together in the same way? I don't know. You could also say that there could be an argument for incentive seeking being a negative signal about the company. So I don't know. It could be that you're in trouble, especially a retention deal. Yeah. You know, you're like, we're thinking of putting the plant in China or India or somewhere else for cost reasons. We need an incentive. We need money from the state government. So it could work in either direction. And I don't, because of that, I think I would sort of punt on that one. Kristen?
How many different sector groupings were there for the non-mediated industries? You said for the mediated industries it was life sciences and
textiles.
And I was just curious how many. I mean, did you categorize the non-mediated, or
so
they're all
that would be
together?
sort of the rest of the economy.
Just the rest of it.
Yeah, we didn't. So we didn't throw out any other ones saying that these aren't in there.
Yeah.
So.
And then how did you match the incentivized companies in those mediated sectors to the control group? How many factors?
So, so there are. I'm going to cheat to look at my advanced slide. Okay. This is the. Appreciate that. I killed that. Oh, no, it's on the end of this. No, it did get lost. So it is basically a set of, I think, 8 different factors. Okay. So it's between 6 and 8. It's in the paper. Basically, it's the year that the firm started. Their 3-digit SIC code. So you're doing, essentially, that's the peer SIC. Whether it was a branch plant of a larger corporation or not, or whether it was a single establishment. A couple other ones. But essentially, basically taking as many firm characteristics as we could get from the nets, and then using that in a propensity score matching process to come up. Essentially, it takes all those characteristics and takes the geometric mean of the values of all those and finds the treatment one that has the closest value. So it's essentially a matched pair across the values of these 6 different characteristics.
Okay, so I don't totally understand all of that, but there's not a factor that's weighted more than another in that approach.
They're sort of equally put into the propensity score matching program. So that's where we were. Thank you for that.
I was thinking of Rob's comment, and I think businesses have a launch synergy. You can have internal energy, you can have internal excitement, and you can take that to a certain point, a certain growth rate. But if you can add to that internally generated synergy, it has like a multiplier effect on growth. To me, a prime example would be the Research Triangle Park. You said earlier whether it started the private sector, whether it started the government, who knows? Who cares?
Doesn't matter,
yeah. What you had was 2 energized organizations that multiplied, that leveraged each other's work. So I would say probably these target industries, these mediated industries, had something internal that separated them from the others. But could they have achieved the same level of growth without these incentivized plans? I doubt it.
Right, and what this 26.8 is doing is saying those that did get an incentive to come to North Carolina, compared to in those similar industries, biotech and textiles, the ones with an incentive added 27 more jobs in this particular sector. Question?
So did you look at the communities that these businesses went into at all?
This is mixing statewide. So this is not, we didn't separate analysis in county by county. We just wouldn't have a large enough sample for that.
It just occurs to me that the mediated industries are probably going into communities where there are some infrastructure already in place that would allow them to be more successful and you use their money more efficiently.
But presumably that the geography of those industries is the same whether or not you got incentive or not. And this is, since it's comparing only to those non-incentivized firms in a similar industry. So if this is biotech and all of biotechs tend to locate in the triangle, the comparison group is also going to be in the triangle. So yeah, the way the control group works kind of addresses that, the variation in location and infrastructure across the state. I mean, if we have data on all the local incentives, I'd love to do this with sort of local effects. Essentially put in a variable to say, okay, well these are the ones in a triangle, and sort of take out that common effect of triangle has a higher growth rate than East or West North Carolina, and try to control for that. But yeah, good question. So in terms of conclusion, and here's where I want to get your feedback on all of these and make sure we're sort of interpreting this in the way that makes sense. This is the way we think of it. We say that this results, it shows that there's modest evidence that both the retention and recruitment incentives result in job creation over the long run relative to control group. So in a very modest way, we're saying that North Carolina's incentives are working, effective, they're being effective. Their effects are strongest, however, when they're used alongside the strategic and long-range planning efforts, suggesting that there's a synergy here, just like what you talked about, the sort of the two coming together in a sort of a synergistic way. And that mediated industries is where this synergy is the strongest, right? That's where there's a deeper investment from the state in these mediated institutions. And it's consistent with the qualitative findings from the colleagues' previous work on how mediation guides the economic development practice. So it's consistent with the observations that we have from a previous study. In sort of broader conclusions or policy implications, the empirical results are indicative essentially of the importance of mediation and mediating institutions. It sort of gives value or shows that these institutions really do add value to the state's economy. And that, so just sort of in terms of adding a little bit to theory, why does mediation produce the results that we've seen? We argue that they do play an important filtering role. So rather than that incentive kind of changing the nature of that company or being such an important factor in the bottom line of these global companies like Novartis or somebody like that, is that they're essentially the process of mediation itself filters out those firms that would come here, take the money, and just leave, right? Or come here, try to start up a company, but their science is really bad, and they fail. So mediation essentially filters out, in the universe of possible incentive deals that we could have done, the really bad eggs. And that's something, that kind of conclusion is something I'd like to hear from you on, if that makes sense to you. This suggests that institutional actors have greater agency than previously assumed. A lot of the literature on economic development says that state actors and local actors are just passive agents. They're playing this poker game with outside companies and just losing. This suggests that that's maybe not the case in certain sectors. It does provide the sort of neutral check against the system bias that Ruben describes, essentially that the local governments have no information relative to the company. These sector initiatives like the Biotech Center and others can give information to that local recruiter and say, hey, you know, we have some value here as the state, and we're not going to just give away the store. And that sectoral initiatives and targeting essentially support the smarter use of incentives. I think that's sort of the tagline of this, is saying mediation can lead to smarter incentive use. Back to my comment of, I don't think incentive use is just going to end overnight or from anybody's study. In terms of what we want to do next, I know Alan's going to write a dissertation next, on similar lines. But in terms of the group, our collective, we want to collect additional data on local incentives and look at the link between some of this mediation process and incentive quality. So not just the outcomes, employment, and things like that, but how does mediation affect the quality of the incentive itself? We want to connect the argument a little bit more, focus on how mediated industries and this sort of how they work in terms of, you know, improving quality, and look at some of the sort of the impacts of the specific deals that were done using some economic impact tools like IMPLAN. And I know Alan was wanting to do some survival analysis, so not just whether or not they grew, but particularly with retention deals, did the ones that got an incentive, did they survive longer in the state? So that's kind of what I wanted to share with you today. I'm happy to receive other comments by email, and if for folks who are interested in the full paper, it's been published as a working paper by the Upjohn Institute, who helped support the research, but it's also in a revision process with another journal. Will be out soon, but I'm happy to share the paper with anybody who's interested. So thank you, and if people want to look at other stuff, I'm happy to go into more detail. I think it's, well, it depends on the size of the pie that we have to deal with, right, in the budget we have for economic development, but let's just assume that that's shrinking right now. I think it does spell for a smarter reallocation of the incentives that go on, and in a way that if we hold the budget constant to all these other mediating sectors, but we wanted to flow more of our incentive granting through these sectors, I think that will sort of naturally create these synergies. But certainly it would help underscore the importance of these institutions at the state level and say, okay, if we decide to defund them or take resources away from them, who's going to be doing this sort of third person in the room in these incentive granting processes? And who's going to be making these links to the community colleges and the story about linking to finance? And I think you'd be sort of missing out on an important asset.
But if we could raise the budget, if we could put more money into it, do you think there's a...
I think that, I mean, that's a tough question, probably one for the governor to answer, but certainly continuing these sectoral initiatives, I think, are important, because there are emerging industries, and certainly around the green economy. I know North Carolina's already doing a lot of that with the Biofuel Center and others, but to give that full resources and to go after additional industries. I mean, if you think back in terms of like in 1981, it was a little bit of a risk to found the Biotech Center, but that risk essentially did pay off. So I mean, are there new opportunities that we're not able to sort of pursue because we're not starting these new sectoral initiatives? Or obviously you don't want to just fund sectoral initiatives forever if they're not successful. I think they need to prove their value over and over again and really show that they're working. But it has been a sort of a success story, I think, for North Carolina compared to other states that don't do this in the same way. Yeah,
in a couple of your slides, it looked like in the mediated sectors, the amount of incentive per job was lower. Did that include the mediation services cost as well? No,
that's including the cash value only of the One North Carolina or the JDIG grants.
So is that a substantial cost, or when you add up the cost of the Biotech Center, does that raise that number dramatically, or is that just a small delta on it?
It would definitely raise it, but how much, I don't know, because we'd have to get the data on the budget, and then essentially that's going to be amortized over all the possible deals.
Right.
And then there was the problem of, okay, well, if they're spending more time with one deal and not another, so it's a little bit tricky. But again, I'd like to keep in mind that dichotomy between something that's a common pool resource and something that's firm specific. So it's somewhat of a sunk cost to build the Biotech Center or to fund that and keep the staff on annually. But that's something that has value even if one firm leaves.
Well, that kind of leads to my second question. Has there been any research on the opportunity costs? If we didn't spend the money this way and spent it in a different way on, say, infrastructure or something like that, do we have a clear idea of what the net benefit is of incentives versus some of those opportunity costs?
No, but something like that could be done it'll be tricky. But there are studies that compare, like, say, what's the job creation impact of state spending on roads or schools or things like that. That's kind of the work that some of the work that the Justice Center's done around the budget.
We did.
Certainly around the budget cuts. But yeah, in terms of sort of a complete cost-benefit framework, I don't know of a study that's tried to do that per se. But it is an interesting way to look at it.
Tim Bartik in Michigan wrote a study looking at investment in childcare, investment in infrastructure, investment in incentive, and compared those two incentives and found that the sort of the broader base common pool kind of public investments way outperformed typical traditional incentives, at least in his study in Michigan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know of the increase in employment? How many of those jobs went to local people who had already been in the area versus people from out of the area who came in to take the jobs?
Unfortunately, no. We're not with this data set because we don't have anything. We don't actually observe the individual worker level. We're just saying, okay, company A, how many employees did you have in time A or time 1 versus time 2 and time 3? So we don't know if those were in-migrants or not from this source. So there has been previous work, again, Tim Bartik, who's kind of like the expert on all things incentives, has done some work looking at that there, in many cases, it is in-migrants. But these ones I don't know, and I don't have a strong sense of whether, and I would probably wager to guess that the retention deals are more likely to hire local workers than recruitment, but I don't know that for sure. And I can't say from the data that that's the case. But is that something that is a concern here?
Yeah, that's a concern, and more than that, the fact that when a worker is brought in from outside, he or she is very likely to bring a spouse who will then be entering the job market, possibly even teenagers who will be entering the teenage summer job market.
Right, so you've just created more job seekers.
Yeah, more unemployment as a result.
Yeah, no, I don't know, and I think, and I know my colleague Nicola's worked on this a bit more, the efforts that North Carolina is making around, it's particularly in the biomanufacturing industry, of connecting these new companies to the community college and having them essentially use the community college system as the recruitment effort can sort of solve a lot of those problems, because presumably the people coming through the community college system are already local residents.
Yeah.
I think almost by statute they have to be doing that. So if you can get a company, particularly a foreign company, to come and use the community college system as the recruitment effort, you've kind of addressed that. And that's a part of the mediation story. So I would say that that's an example of best practice. Does it happen systematically? I can't tell you if that's the case. But yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.